Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask you to take your seats as quickly as possible and bring your conversations to an end. Thank you very much. Right, so I hope you have had a very good lunch. I hope you've had a chance to chat to each other and to our very generous sponsors. Our next topic has come up a bit already. Precision breeding. With me are Penny Hundleby, Senior Scientist at the John Innes Centre, and Dr. Mark Young, who's Head of Innovation at CL. And we're going to talk about gene technology. They will be taking questions afterwards, so please get your thoughts onto Slido. Let's get on with our afternoon session, starting with Penny.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm quite daunted after following all these excellent talks that we've had this morning. As Charlotte says, I'm a scientist. My first slide has disappeared. I'm a scientist and I work at the John Innes Centre. So the John Innes Centre is a plant and microbial research centre. We're based in Norwich on the Norwich Research Park. And I don't know what's happening with my slides because they've obviously got a mind of their own and they're doing their own thing. So let's just ignore the fact that I've lost all my animation on this slide. So what I want to do today is, so I've worked with genetic technologies for the last 29 years, so both GM and gene editing. And what I want to get across to you today is what the differences are. And I have no idea. You're going to see all my punchlines before they get there. What's happening with my slides. But what I want to get away with today is for you to understand the difference between GM and gene editing and which of these technologies fall within the precision breeding bill. So I'm going to attempt to keep the science quite light in my talk, but there are a few basics that you do need to appreciate beforehand. So we'll start off with DNA. So DNA is the information that we need to make and maintain us. So all that information is stored into every single cell in our bodies, in our plants. And DNA is made up of these building blocks called bases. So we represent these in this cartoon here with these A's, C's, T's and G's. So you can think of this as the alphabet of life. And these are universal across all species. So the A's that are in you are also the same as the A's that are in wheat. And they make up our genetic sequence. So we now have the ability to sequence genomes, which means that we can take DNA from an organism and we can put it through some fancy technology which you can now read the exact order in which these letters appear throughout the genome. Now, changes in this sequence confer genetic variation. So we've got a really great example of genetic variation in this audience today. So if I was to compare your genome sequence, it would be 99.9% identical. But those differences in that genome sequence, so that order in which those letters appear, give us the variation that we see today. So if we take something like eye colour, the difference between brown eyes and blue eyes is just a single letter change, so a point mutation. And those mutations are occurring all the time. So mutations can occur through damage to DNA, so we can lose genetic sequence, or we can create breaks in the DNA and a cell will try to repair those breaks. And in doing so, we can lose the odd base, or we can recruit the different base. So you're introducing point mutations. And this is what plant breeders are looking for. So they're looking for differences within populations to try and identify new desirable traits. So that underpins crop improvement. The other concept is that we inherit half of our genetic information from both parents. So if we take these two different crops here, so they're both the same species, so broccoli, and what you can see next to it is wild Brassica oleracea. So that's what our broccoli would look like if plant breeders had never got to it. But if we go back to these sort of older populations, we've got this huge array of genetic variation and genetic diversity. So imagine we wanted to reintroduce a disease resistance gene from this wild Brassica oleracea back into broccoli. We would cross the two parents together in order to introduce that new trait, that disease resistance. But as well as introducing that gene for disease resistance, we're also going to be introducing tens of thousands of genes that we don't want. So what we'd then have to do is take the offspring and back-cross it to the elite line over several generations so that we get something that looks more like your broccoli but has introduced your disease resistance trait. Now, GM technology, which was developed in the 1980s, allowed us to clone just the gene that we want and introduce it into our elite lines. So you can see that that very much speeds up the breeding process. Now, as I mentioned beforehand, those A's, T's and C's are universal, and because we're no longer needing to sexually cross plants together to introduce these new genetic traits, it means we can now take genes from unrelated species. So I could take a disease resistance gene from wheat and introduce it into broccoli. But I could also take a gene from a completely unrelated species, like a bacteria. And so most of the first generation GM crops that are out there, so the herbicide tolerance and the insect resistance, contain genes from bacteria which confer these traits. So just to define that, when we've introduced DNA or genetic sequence from a completely unrelated, uncrossable species, we refer to these as transgenic, so trans meaning different. And where we've introduced genetic sequence or genes from the same species, we refer to these as cisgenics, and the new Precision Breeding Bill gives scope for cisgenics to be included. So let's give you an example of a GM field trial. So this is work by colleagues at the Sainsbury Laboratory. So what you're looking at here now is a field of potatoes. These have been untreated, so not sprayed by fungicides, and I hope you can see that half of them have been decimated by late potato blight, and half of them look green and healthy, and those of course are the GM crops there. So what's happened here is the group at the Sainsbury Laboratory have isolated 3 genes from a wild potato relative and reintroduced those into those commercial lines. So I hope this gives you a good example of where we can use genetic solutions to reduce our need for chemical inputs. This technology is not being used in the UK, but it is being used in the States and other parts of the world where they've embraced the technology. So gene editing is slightly different. It's a tool. So there's lots of different gene editing approaches we can use. The one that's used most widely by scientists is one called CRISPR. So CRISPR just stands for Clustered Regularly Interspersed Palindromic Repeats, which doesn't help you understand the technology at all. But essentially, it's a tool which allows us to cut the DNA at a precise location. So depending on what you do with this tool will depend on how it's regulated. So in the very simplest of form, if we make 2 cuts to the DNA close together, we can delete genetic sequence. If we make a single cut, we're hoping that the plant will then try to repair that cut. It may then recruit the wrong base, or it might delete the wrong base. And so you're introducing a point mutation at that location. So it's doing something that could happen naturally, but we're putting it at a very precise location. And so using this technology in this way, these would fall under the Precision Breeding Bill. We can also use the technology to open up the genome at precise location in order to introduce new genetic sequence or actually take out a gene and replace it with a gene. We can consider this to be the upgrade to GM technology. It will still be regulated as GMOs if that new genetic sequence comes from a different species, but if it comes from the same species, this would be a cisgenic and it could fall under the Precision Breeding Bill. So I want to give you a worked example of that. So here we've got a field of oilseed rape. Now our farmers face great challenges even getting to this stage at the moment, but imagine you've got a really good field of oilseed rape. What you don't want to do is then lose some of your yield as a result of early pod shatter in the field. So can we use gene editing to address this problem? So what I'm showing you now on this scary looking slide is a page of genomic sequence. If I was to show you the entire genome sequence for oilseed rape, I'd need to show you about 1 million screenshots like this. So all that information is packed into our cells. We're now at this sort of big data time. We can compare genomes between species and within species to enable us to identify our gene sequence. So this is our candidate gene. This is the gene that we believe is involved in pod formation. And then we use computer software. So again, this is all happening on a computer. We use computer software to identify a 20-base sequence that is unique to your gene of interest and nowhere else within the genome. We would then design a molecular guide that we can introduce into the cell that hunts out this sequence. So you can imagine it's a bit like a Google search engine. We're hunting for the sequence that we want to make a difference to. We then introduce a nuclease, so an enzyme which cuts DNA. So we can think of that as like a pair of scissors. So we're cutting our gene at a precise location. So we're not adding anything new, we're just making a break in that region. And this is what it looks like. So here what you're seeing now is a cross-section of 2 pods, and you can see where that green arrow is. That's where our valve margin would form, so that's where your pods would break open. And you can see where we've targeted our guide, and where it's circled is where we've made that break. And you can see that we've got a C to T change, and we've lost a G base. So in the billions of letters in the oilseed rape genome, we've made 2 changes, and hopefully you can see in the edited version that valve margin no longer forms. So that's how we've disrupted that gene from forming. So that's a very flash view of the difference between GM and gene editing. And so gene editing and precision breeding really has the potential to benefit farmers, the environment and the economy. And there's a whole host of different things that we can do with it. But the ones that are coming through to market currently or in the field trial stages are work to develop more resilient crops. So we're seeing some nice work looking at disease resistance. You can just about make out on that far left, is it left? Right-hand side image, some pictures of some wheat. And here, so wheat contains something around between 100 to 200,000 genes. We've made 2 deletions in 2 genes, and we've got yellow rust resistance. We're also seeing some work to develop pest-resistant plants, as well as plants that are better adapted to climate change. So there's some nice work going on in Brazil. So we've got some drought-tolerant soybean that has been brought to market. And we can also use this technology to open up new markets, so to create new crops or to develop underutilised crops that are better adapted to growing here. So in this one image here, we've got cowpeas, and they've been edited so that so that's a crop that is hand harvested. These have been edited to change the plant architecture so they lift higher up off the ground so they can be mechanically farmed. We're also seeing work to increase yields. On this top image here, you can see some wheat. And in this particular piece of work, they've made 3 deletions to 3 genes, and you can see an increase in yields of up to 20%. Also work to reduce food waste as well. And the other things we're seeing is editing to make healthier crops. So in the US, we've already got these salad greens, which are being edited to have higher nutrient levels. And at the John Lynn Centre, we've got these vitamin D enhanced tomatoes. So that's a very quick flash talk through, but I hope I've managed to convince you that the new Precision Breeding Technologies Act really gives us this opportunity to take advantage of our knowledge of genomics. So our ability to sequence genomes is fast improving. When you think that the first human genome took 10 years to sequence, cost billions of pounds, we could now sequence a genome within a day. So this technology is rapidly advancing. So it very much brings us into this new era of intelligent precision-based breeding. The new Act brings us in line with the views of a number of other countries across the globe. And so, you know, it gives us the opportunity to stay competitive if we're allowed to embrace it. But I think what's been quite clear in the talks today is that, you know, science is only part of the story. So I can tell you what's possible and that the technology is safe, but it's really down to consumers and industry, so the people in this room, as to whether these technologies will be embraced. And with that, I'll hand over to Mark.
Thanks very much, Penny. A pretty hard act to follow. She's done a great job of telling you a lot about genetics, and I learned 1 or 2 things watching that. You can see I'm a different generation. So in terms of this for livestock, it's as simple in a livestock sense as thinking about some of the traits which can be problems. In this particular case, horns in cattle are viewed by a lot of people working with livestock as being both a danger to themselves and to their other animals. We know that's controlled by a simple gene, yet the idea of crossing, like Penny suggested, and introducing that gene from, say, an Aberdeen Angus into a Friesian, or a Holstein milk cow, would be much better if we could take the Holstein and just simply eliminate the horn gene by turning it into the pole gene. So that's one example from animal science. There are fewer when you look at it than compared to the myriad of examples that we've got that Penny presented there. So if we look at this idea, Penny defined the fact that GMO is something outside the precision breeding, and a PBO is inside it. So PBO stands for precision breeding organism, and that's the same as a traditional breeding organism, which is things gone through the traditional methods of selection and improvement. So if we look at that, at the moment DEFRA says they're effectively the same thing. And that ties in with Penny's qualification that if the gene is already in a population and you select it to increase in frequency, that's traditional breeding. We can do it more precisely and more quickly without bringing other genes from crossing different animals from different backgrounds. So at the moment, that's the definition there, and that's effectively the cisgenics she talked about. So when it comes to regulation and how it relates to animals, the GMOs have an oversight which is covered by legislation that was inherited or brought in from the EU, and that hasn't changed. By comparison, the PBO, the precision bred organism, that's covered by the FSA, and there's a group called the Advisory Committee for Novel Foods and Processes. They're aiming to have regulations and processes in place by the end of 2024, and an earlier speaker today talked about that. The point being for this group, they'll be consulting shortly about how that will look. So there may be opportunities for you to be able to contribute to that consultation. There's also the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment. And this is about the environmental risk that some people are worried about. That particular group are out considering GMO applications at the moment. There aren't any PBO applications that they've got. But there's also another group, which is the DEFRA Animal Welfare Group. And they've been given the brief of looking at welfare issues that are specific to precision breeding. So it's not about general welfare, it's about things that will come up from the precision breeding. And that group is also considering how to regulate in terms of the welfare dimension. And some of the science groups in this country are involved in that at the moment. So the question might be, from a livestock point of view, what welfare issues might there be that are relevant to that and not to just general welfare regulations? The key idea here being that the PBO is the same as a TBO. So traditional breeding and precision breeding that results in bringing a gene into the population that could be got there by natural means. It's just a faster, more precise way, so therefore it's treated as being of the same type of outcome. So in terms of precision breedings for livestock, Penny's gone on to it. There's examples for substituting one gene for another. The obvious ones are that horn gene I've given you. It's fixing a defective gene. If there's highly valuable animals that have a particular genetic defect, there's an obvious area there to fix that. But there's also the area of breaking antagonistic genetic linkage. And that's where genes that are useful may actually be paired with or very closely linked in that genetic sequence with genes that are not so good. And you want to break that linkage so that you can get the good combinations together. And with traditional breeding, it's very hard to break that genetic linkage. You basically got to wait a long time for a natural mutation to occur. Longer than I've got to live anyway. The other one is this rapid introduction of a gene from one population into another. That's the really obvious one. Genes from one breed that you can bring into another breed very quickly, so you've got the advantage of that breed without changing the rest of the genetic makeup and having to, as a result of crossbreeding, then spend generations breeding out the bits that came with it that you didn't want. Therefore, it reduces genetic lag, so you're getting faster genetic gain for all traits. And therefore, you get a faster breeding program. You can concentrate on more things or different things in sequence over a shorter period of time. The novel changes, and this is where we're going beyond the cisgenetics, and this is the changes that wouldn't naturally occur. One of the best examples of that is some work that the Rosner Institute have done on PRRS-resistant pigs. So this is the porcine respiratory disease. They went and looked for candidate genes that would stop the virus from doing what it does. And they decided, looking at genome sequences and knowing about the physiology, that there were two sites on the cell surface that would might stop the virus getting into the cell where it reproduces and causes the effects of the disease. And they, as they said to me the other day, they were very lucky. One of them worked. And so basically, they found a subtle change that when that one gene changes, that entry point on the cell surface for the virus is blocked for the PRRS virus. And so it's a great job that it's delivered disease resistance with a thing that wasn't there before. So the question then about these changes is, one more example. In terms of gender skewing, this is an interesting one. If you look at the reproductive rate in ruminant animals in particular, it's a real limitation to the speed of genetic change in animals, as well as the efficiency of production. And gender skewing could offer a real big change here. We know that artificial insemination was a major leap forward for ruminant cattle genetics. And we know that multiple ovulation embryo transfer has offered some, and sex semen has offered another leap forward in that. And interestingly, apparently the UK is the greatest user of sex semen for cattle in the world. And that's resulted in a doubling of the selection intensity on the female side for their genetic improvement. And it also means we've shifted from 50% of beef animals born to dairy cows up from beef-bred bulls from dairy cows bred from a beef bull and a dairy cow calves are gone from 50% to 75%, which brings another efficiency for beef production. So this gender skewing is an interesting one. So what we're saying here is, can we knock out a gene in a bull only produces female spermatozoa or only produces male spermatozoa? And that knockout gene could be a real improvement in efficiency for farming, but it could also help our breeding programs by giving us more selection candidates of a particular type. So the question really is, how does this fit with what we know about animal genetics? So most of the high-level traits that affect farm profitability are controlled by multiple genes, and not only that, those genes often affect more than one trait. So it's not as simple as saying there's a gene for milk production or a gene for this. There is definitely a scope and opportunity for precision breeding, but it's unlikely to be changing the amount of milk yield or the rate at which animals grow anytime soon. Another thing when it comes to disease is we know that pathogens evolve very fast. So the COVID is probably one of the best examples. We keep having to get new vaccines because the bacteria evolves to work against the control mechanism we've got with the previous vaccine. So there may be elements of that too, where some disease organisms adapt against some changes we make to halt them. So don't expect that something will have a permanent effect there. So the traditional breeding was constrained by reproductive rates, so control of the sex of offspring and livestock is a real way to help both productivity and give some extra fuel to the speed at which we get our genetic improvement programs. And the more genes we have that we're trying to improve, we can have lots of traits that are single genes and other traits that are multiple genes. The more things you want to improve, the greater you have to spread your effort. So when it comes to lots of things needing to be changed, traditional breeding will always be there, but there's a role for precision breeding, and that's where there's real game changers. And I think about things like avian influenza, some of these African swine fever, foot and mouth disease. If some of these things, we can find a simple gene that will help knock them back and they have much less impact on our agriculture, that's where we should be focusing precision breeding for livestock agriculture. The people at Roslin are beginning work on this. They've got selection lines that they're trying to develop where they've changed a gene, and one of them is related to heat resistance in cattle, and another one is heat resistance or heat tolerance in sheep. So this shows a remarkable commitment to the fact we're going to get global warming in Scotland. Because we do have the dilemma that the people who are leading on the development of precision breeding for livestock are in Scotland. And that's at the Roslin Institute. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for that, guys. Quite a lot of questions already. Please add more if you want to via Slido. Again, I'll start with the most popular, so if you thumbs up the one you like, then that will probably get asked. The first one, in fact, I'm going to put two together here. To make it publicly acceptable, should we be approaching gene editing from the perspective of environmental benefits, health benefits, or price benefits? What would you sell it on?
I think there's areas for all of them.
But if you had to prioritise?
I think if I had to prioritise, I think the public are really embracing climate change and sustainable farming. So I think that's a big winner. But consumers ultimately want things that they want. So health benefits are also a key one for consumers.
Mark, what would you go on?
I would go animal health and environment, and I would say we're very concerned, or the public are very concerned about methane from ruminants. There's ways you can do it with traditional selection. We're talking about feed additives. Why don't we actually go in and try and engineer something in the microbe that's doing it?
Okay, let's do a quick show of hands. If you were leading on this, would you push the environmental benefits? Hands up. Okay. Who would push health benefits?
You mean to the consumer?
Yeah, I think to the consumer, because it's all about me, isn't it? I'm the consumer. Price benefits. Okay, so health just wins. Okay, let's move on. How can we ensure farmers, merchants and food companies embrace gene editing and don't repeat the GMO misinformation that we had during the 90s? And allied to that, how do we prevent GM and GE free becoming a point of difference for retail and other markets?
Do you want me to? It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because so America chose not to label GM products at the beginning, and then we saw this massive launch of the non-GMO project. And so now you're seeing labels saying GMO-free wheat. There's no GM wheat out there at the moment, and so it's completely pointless labelling. So I know the FSA are quite keen not to label these products, whereas a lot of developers actually kind of want to embrace and say, we're using this great technology. So I don't know the answer to it. I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But again, yeah, we are in danger of repeating the same situation that we saw with GM if we're not careful. But I think a lot of that comes down to education as well. So I think we were looking recently at the national curriculum, and so precision breeding isn't on the national curriculum. So GM is now coming on. Well, has been for a while, but this is 30-year-old technology. It's 30-year-old technology with a safe history of use, but it still has this controversy. And I think we really need to get in and explain the technologies. But I also think that people are lacking in an awareness of how our food is developed and how plant breeding in general works. So I think there's more we could do there so that it shows that it's not a scary technology, and we need to not be afraid of technology.
I can't add much more to that. I think it needs to be about presenting information in an easily digestible form to the public so they understand the system better. I know there's an example for livestock to do with a thing called A2 milk, and the New Zealand dairy industry got very upset with a scientist in New Zealand who said A2 milk's good for you and A1 milk's bad for you. It's a different form of a protein. And the main reason they got upset with them is they couldn't change with traditional breeding very quickly. Precision breeding would allow you to make that sort of change quickly, and A1 milk can't be as easily digested by some people as others. So,
okay, what impact will AI have on GE?
So
it's
huge.
not artificial insemination.
No, not that AI, the other AI.
That's what I call the elder AI.
So I think it's huge. So I think we have the ability to sequence genomes. So if you imagine, there's huge populations. So for example, wheat, there's over 800,000 wheat accessions out there. And we could start looking at these genomes and looking at phenotypes. So, which crops grow really well in hot countries, and what is it about those crops that makes them well? So we can start looking at patterns. So in the future, this is definitely something that will happen. In terms of funders, if you mention the word AI and gene editing, you get extra funding. So I think it will be huge.
work.
It'll certainly be a way to make sense of the information that's out there. I have some concerns about it for certain traits. Like if you're going searching for the bit of DNA that gives gene resistance in one plant and not in another, fantastic. But with some of the other more complex biology, I hope the data scientists know as much about biology as they think they know about data.
Will it make either of you redundant, as it apparently is going to make me completely redundant?
I'm kind of hoping not. Gene editing will always be there as a research tool. So, so I've been working with GM technology for nearly 30 years, and obviously we don't grow any GM in the UK. So we use it as a research tool. So gene editing will always have that place. So if we can knock out a gene, we understand what a gene does. And that will then feed into traditional breeding. So there's always scope for that. And the possibilities are endless if we're allowed to use it.
I would extend that by saying the AI will help us understand about genetics in different situations too. So that you may not get exactly the same outcome from the same genes in different situations. You need lots of data to answer that question. AI will help answer it.
Okay, here's another question. Could we find a sweet spot in terms of breeding more digestible plant-based feed materials for feeding to animals which are bred to make greater use of those nutrients?
Good environmental outcome.
Yeah. Could we do that?
Yes.
When could we do that?
It's a big question, isn't it? So you need to understand. You need to understand systems. So you need to, I can't answer that one quickly.
No, you don't have to, no.
When it comes to digestion, the indigestible part is an important part of the process because fibre and the microbes that live around it are part of what help animals digest other things more efficiently. So it's not as simple as digesting more of it and being better off.
Okay. The EU proposals don't include livestock, the UK's do. Is the UK potentially able to be a world leader here?
Yes.
How?
By one of the key things will be getting appropriate regulation in place, and that regulation needs to have all stakeholders involved, and it needs to have an appropriate look at risk. We don't want to be so risk averse that we constrain it, but at the same time we don't want to say let's throw everything at it and see what we can do, because that will lose public confidence. So if we can get that right, and we're just going looking for the things that are best to fix, and the obvious ones for me are diseases for livestock.
Okay.
But I think animal welfare is really key to the changes in the legislation, isn't it? So I think in order for you to bring a precision-bred animal to market, you have to show that what you've changed doesn't negatively affect those animals. So you don't want disease-resistant animals that you then breed in much bigger populations. So you have to show that you're not going to damage animal welfare.
There's challenges from traditional breeding there, so we can learn from that.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Do adaptations in genes, once edited, get bred out forever? Could species lose potentially beneficial traits which aren't needed today but might be needed tomorrow?
Well, we've already seen that in plant breeding. So, if you look at vegetable brassicas, we've bred those for yield, we've bred them for flavour, we've bred them for appearance, and we've bred them to be reliant on chemical inputs. So, they are sort of more susceptible to, we've made them tastier for us, so they're tastier for insects. So we've lost some of that natural insect resistance. And so we can actually go back to older populations and look to see what traits they have, and we could reintroduce them.
Back to the old-fashioned Brussels sprout, I guess.
Please, God, no.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any studies on how food that's undergone precision breeding affects animals' health and therefore humans?
I think you kind of have to put it into perspective. So what we're making is very small changes. So if you think of something like mutation breeding, so that's a technology where we can introduce new genetic variation. So we expose seeds to chemicals or radiation in order to induce hundreds of thousands of random mutations throughout the genome. And plant breeders have the ability to get rid of those unwanted mutations, and they have a safe history of use. So I think we have to, with these new technologies, we're not creating something weird and wonderful. We're getting to the same endpoint that traditional plant breeding can get us to, but we can get there much faster. So, you know, those...
More precisely too.
Yeah. So those sort of challenges with you know, systems are the same, regardless of the technology, I think, to get us there.
Okay. What's the future of CRISPR in the UK? Will the seeds or plants Will the seeds or plants developed using precision breeding be more affordable for growers and consumers?
So I think that's an interesting one. So I think the regulations allow us to use these technologies, but I think the big elephant in the room still is IP. And I don't know how to answer that one. So whether it's actually eventually going to be affordable for breeders to use, I think is something that needs to be looked at.
Okay. As specific genome of plants enhanced focuses on the needed genes of a species, how are the unenhanced genes in the species protected with the adaptability of plants? Do you see what I mean?
No.
Okay, I think it's what happens to things that you're not targeting.
So again, I think you have to kind of look at traditional plant breeding. So we're not doing anything different. You know, plant breeding is all about introducing new traits. So I think it has to be proportional. So yeah, understanding this.
There's also a testing regime. You don't edit a gene and sell the seed before you've ever seen what happens. So there will still be trials that says this performs well. We get the same yield, the composition of the grain or whatever is the same. So there still are controls that will be part of the process.
What can we learn from markets where gene editing is already in place and accepted by the public?
So I think in the US, those earlier traits that are coming through are all about consumer benefits. So it's those nutrient-dense salads. And so I think consumers need... There is that whole risk benefit, isn't it? If people don't understand the technology, they're adverse to it. So there has to be a benefit for them. And so I think we have to kind of weigh up those.
In that regard, working with genes that are already in the population is the best way to start, because it's not unnatural that the gene is there.
Okay, have we had any examples of precision breeding reducing methane emissions in ruminants as yet?
Not that I'm aware of.
But that would be big if we did.
The precision would have to happen in the microbe. We don't quite know what the mechanism... We know that genetically you can select cattle or sheep to have lower methane emissions. We don't know what the mechanism is. But if you target the microbe, you could probably get to it.
How does gene editing sit alongside the growing popularity of regenerative farming?
So I think even with GM technology, so there are definite GM technologies that would sit really well with organic farming. So the blight-resistant potatoes, I think, would sit really well with organic farming, but they've kind of positioned themselves out of the market. So I do think that gene editing and traditional plant breeding sits well with regenerative farming.
I think the same for livestock. It's about helping the farmers manage livestock or the crop they're growing, and therefore it's about solving problems like health challenges, drought resistant, other sorts of things to do with how strong the hoof on the animal is, if it's something to do with keratin in the hoof.
Okay, I'm going to put two together here. What are the dangers of gene editing? What could be the side effects or the problems of advanced evolutionary adaptations to benefit our requirements today, later on? And if the end result of some gene editing results in mutations, how will that affect humans when consumed? Are there any studies on that towards cancer, for instance, they ask? So, dangers and downsides. Possibly ask them.
I would expect the dangers of eating a gene-edited crop to be minimal, because we digest it and we break it down. And I think the chance of a gene jumping out of a piece of lettuce into my genome is pretty low. I may be wrong.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the evolutionary adaptations to benefit our requirements, the beauty of the genetic improvement commercial world is they're constantly looking for adaptations that are good. They'll pick up adaptations or manifestations that are bad. So the system in some regards is self-regulating because we want good production.
agree.
Okay. How do you identify the genes that relate to the traits that you want to affect?
Okay, that's a good question. So, for example, the one that I highlighted on that screen, so we have this model plant called Arabidopsis. So it's the equivalent to, in human studies, we have mice as our model species. So Arabidopsis is this little weed. It's got a very small genome and it's got a fast life cycle. And we've got mutation populations, so where seeds have been exposed to chemicals or radiation in order to knock out genes. And by looking at your wild types with your mutation versions, you can actually identify which genes control those traits. And so we're using software, so I know the sequence in this model plant. I can blast that against our brassica genome to look for the closest match, and that becomes our candidate gene. So that's the gene that we think controls the trait, and then if we knock it out, we can then see by looking at the edited plant and the non-edited plant, does that gene control that trait?
So you have to wait till it grows to work out if it's had what effect it's had?
Yeah.
So it's still relatively, you have to be quite a patient person.
Yes, but if you actually think, so gene editing was first published in 2013, and we were using that technology and published a paper on knocking out that gene within 2 years. So it is fairly quick.
Is there a traceability system in place or in plan to ensure moral obligations to companies who develop plants with CRISPR?
So I think the FSA is proposing that there will be a database, and I think maybe I could probably pass the question over to some of the plant breeders, because they already have systems in place where they can trace seed varieties. So I think we could sort of tap into that.
Mark, anything to add?
I was going to ask the previous question. In livestock, how do you find out where a gene is? One of the approaches is to look for large populations of animals where you have both a genetic fingerprint and a measure of the performance for the trait you're interested in. Let's call it a disease incidence or not. And you then look for which bits of DNA are different in the different groups of animals. And it's a numbers game. It's more precise and quicker the more data you've got. With this one about traceability, I don't think we've come across that in an animal point of view. It raises the interesting question of patent rights on natural genes.
Yeah, okay. How are Canada, the USA and Brazil approaching gene editing? Is there international consistency in the regulatory space?
So it's evolving. So the US, Canada, Japan, Brazil, a number of other countries are regulating. So there's different types of gene editing. So there's 3 categories. They call them SDN 1, 2, and 3. So that's site-directed nucleases 1, 2, and 3. So where we've made deletions, that's one category. Where we've made small changes is a second category, and where we've introduced new genetic sequences, another category. So pretty much the countries that have moved forward, where we've made small deletions or small, letter changes, they're choosing to regulate those in line with traditional plant breeding. Yeah.
I said it all when I quoted what the different ways the PBOs and the TBOs were being brought together, and the fact that we've got these committees looking at the regulation and the process. So I think that's much more about the process, so that the plant or animal breeding companies actually know what the process is in order to get a product to market. And I think that's the important part that's happening now.
And presumably if it's similar in lots of big markets, that helps.
It will do in terms of setting precedents, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can next generation sequencing be improved using AI? If yes, how? If no, why?
I think it's a very good question.
That's a politician's answer.
No, it's beyond my ken, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. That's allowed.
I think we're seeing massive improvements in sequencing, and the costs are coming down dramatically.
Brilliant. That's it. That's all we have time for. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
indeed for answering a load of questions. Thank you very much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on. We have a Slido. Does the industry believe that gene editing will provide new opportunities to the agri-supply sector in the agri-supply chain in the coming years? Please vote now. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, strongly agreeing on 80%. So, oh, as I say that, it goes down. Oh, no, it's gone up, 83, 78. I think we're settling about there. So there's a lot of optimism about the impact of gene editing and the opportunities that it will provide. Right, let's move on for our final session of the day. We're going to talk about a different perspective to natural capital from Northern Ireland and from the Netherlands. Let's start with Professor John Gilliland from Queen's University in Belfast. He is a man with many hats. He is a farmer. He also chaired the writing of Northern Ireland's Sustainable Land Strategy. Please welcome him, John.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And can I thank AIC for inviting me along here to really share our journey. And can I also congratulate AIC? I see what it means. I'm just trying to get my slides right. Okay. Can I congratulate them for their 20 years? I believe you're 20 years old, and I actually do remember when you were born. I was then president of the Ulster Farmers Union, so I do remember when it happened. So happy birthday to AIC. Today, I want to share with you, Northern Ireland's done something different in land management. And I want to share why we did something different, how did we actually do it, and also what does it mean for the rest of the UK. I am going to wear many hats today. I had the privilege of chairing the expert working group that wrote the Sustainable Land Management Strategy. I've chaired an EIP operational group called ARC Zero, which is about taking 7 farms in Northern Ireland on a journey to net zero. And currently, I help both AHDB and Quality Meat Scotland embrace the journey to net zero and really act as a thought leader, sharing what we've done and how might that sit within Great Britain. So, where did we start? Well, it started when I got a telephone call from the Permanent Secretary in Belfast. I want to come and visit your farm. Now, in my case, I live in the city of Derry. My farm is actually surrounded by the city of Derry. And when a Permanent Secretary in Belfast says he wants to visit you, sure as anything, before they leave, they will have an ask. And that he did have an ask. And the ask was, would you put a multi-stakeholder grouping together? Northern Ireland needs a sustainable land management strategy, and would you chair it? So that was set up in 2014. I had the free hand on who would be in that and the diversity. And I made sure right from day one it would be inclusive. So sitting in the middle of that grouping where, 3 or 4 really good farmers, but I also had 2 or 3 really good from the NGOs. From policy, I made 2 civil servants bear and grin and support us and participate in this because I didn't want another strategy gathering dust. I wanted it to actually get traction. And we had 2 people who were in the food chain as well. We published our document in October 2016. And what was interesting when we published our document, it went to the Minister with 2 attached letters. One from the President of the Ulster Farmers Union saying we endorsed it, and one from the Chair of Northern Ireland Environment Link, who is the collection of environmental NGOs in Northern Ireland, saying that they also endorsed it. And that's really helpful if you go and present something to politicians, that you do the heavy lifting for them and that you do most of that consulting before you give it to them. The other thing, at that stage we were still within the European Union, is DG Ag and DG Environment actually singled it out as exemplary, which was really quite stunning to get that support. Core in what we did is we did a sort of state of the nation. Where were we back in that period of 2016? And if we looked at the issue around environmental performance, what we'd seen from 2004 when Northern Ireland was made a total nitrates vulnerable zone is that actually we were going in the right direction. We've got nitrogen balance down, nitrogen efficiency up, phosphate balance down, phosphate efficiency dramatically up, and our nitrogen levels in water was good. And we weren't approaching the 50 milligram that was the cutoff. But there was a big but. And the but was that 62% of our water bodies were failing good quality status. 80% of the phosphate that was going into those waters was actually running off agricultural land during extreme rainfall, and that this phosphate had an extraordinary tail and hanging around in the environment for 50 years plus. And if anyone's seen the recent news in the last 2 months about Lough Neagh, actually a lot of our problems in Lough Neagh is from heritage phosphate that ran into Lough Neagh in the 1970s and 80s, but because Lough Neagh's water temperature has increased by 1 degree in the last 20 years, it's now remobilizing. And so when we looked at production practices, there were some things there that made our eyes drop as well. And that was Northern Ireland's agriculture is predominantly grass-based, it's predominantly livestock. And when we looked at one of the key metrics, which was grass utilization rather than grass yield, what we found is our grass utilization was awful. It was sitting at 5.1 against at the top 5% sitting at 16 tonne per hectare. If we then dug in behind that, what we found is nobody was doing soil analysis. And what I find with livestock farming is a lot of people know their animals inside out, but know nothing about the soil that they stand on top of. And only 2% of our land went forward for soil sampling. When we looked at the samples that were taken, 64% were not meeting optimal fertility. At that stage, it was pH 6. Actually, if you want to go to a legume-based agriculture where we're weaning ourselves off synthetic nitrogen, you need to be at 6.5. And only 18% of our soil was at optimal fertility. Add to that, we had the least populated number of trees, 6% of our land in trees. And added to that is 30% of our land was in 11-month rental. And if you want to go on sustainable land management, you're going to have to somehow get your head around that landlord-tenant relationship. So what did we recommend? Well, the key principle is if you can't measure, you can't manage. It's quite simple. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, what sector you're in, you need to measure and manage. Measure and manage. So our recommendation is every field, every tree, every hedge in Northern Ireland should be measured. And it should be measured every 5 years and repeat that process. Aided by the fact there is now a generation of new technologies out there to allow you to do that. The two we particularly singled out on, one was an aerial LiDAR survey, where we were surveying land at 40 scans per square metre compared to a satellite at 1 scan per 10 square metres. So getting a resolution and a granularity that would actually pick up change in the landscape. Because it's really important, if we want farmers to change their behaviour, it's really important that behavioural change is actually picked up and fed into the greenhouse gas inventory and fed into Scope 3 emission declarations. None of that happens today. And actually that's one of our big stumbling blocks. So we reached for technologies like aerial LiDAR, but we also reached for technologies that would measure our soil carbon down to a metre, but at a price point that absolutely makes soil carbon sampling across the whole of the nation plausible and possible. The benefit of doing that is data then allows us to go to better accuracy, we get rid of averages, and we can get to tier 3 in our life cycle assessment calculators. So the response from government, the Permanent Secretary said, John, you are joking. Because we put a £45 million cost beside the job of doing that. What he did do, he produced $1.5 million. He says, well, we'll give you 3 river catchments, and if you prove to us farmers change their behaviour, we might look at it, okay? So off we did. We took our $1.5 million, courtesy of the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute of Northern Ireland, and we got an 80% farmer uptake across those catchments, and we also did a light touch then randomly across the rest of Northern Ireland. What was really interesting when we came back 2 years later, we used a team of social scientists from Leeds University to go in and actually survey behavioural change. And what we found is 80% of the farmers changed their behaviour because we empowered them. We made them better farmers. We gave them the information of their farm back to them. They then made better quality decisions. So you can see a list of different metrics that we measured there. But quite clearly in all of that, we also gave them a thing called a runoff risk map where we amalgamated aerial LiDAR along with precision soil sampling analysis. And we could see exactly where we were impacting water quality. We could see exactly where our above ground habitats were, where the connectivity was, where the connectivity wasn't. And really this was a step up for them. They were getting something out of it, and they were changing their behaviour. In the meantime, as government digested this, government in Belfast launched a week into lockdown a EIP operational group competition. Those were held also in the rest of Great Britain, except you did it 2 or 3 years earlier because you had governments and we didn't have. And so I had my arm twisted by 6 of my farming colleagues. We should put a bid in. We should have a go at actually taking our farms on a journey to net zero. So ARC0 was created. ARC0 is an acronym for Accelerating Ruminant Carbons to Zero. And you can see the 7 farms there, geographically spread, enterprise spread, soil type spread, and done deliberately to give us a feel of the highs and lows, the strengths, the weaknesses there. And supported by government, but also supported then by AgriSearch, Burnley Consultant, my old employer Devonish Nutrition, and Queen's University. So what did we do? Well, what we want to know as farmers is we want to learn our numbers. Because, we're all asking farmers to go to net zero, but most farmers actually don't know their numbers. They don't know where their emissions come from, how much comes from where. They don't know where their carbon stocks are, whether they're good, they're bad. So actually, if you want to get behavioural change, you need to help land managers and farmers know their numbers. So what do? We went out and baselined and we benchmarked. Courtesy of SRUC's AgriCalc, we looked at our greenhouse gas emissions, we looked at our segregation, we measured our carbon stocks in trees and hedges. We created for the first time ever our net carbon position for each of those 7 farms. And from that, we then were informed and we changed our behaviour. And doing it in a manner that we optimise multiple public goods at the same time. So just to give you a feel what that looks like when you do that. So here are the 7 farms and their actual data. And what you can see are the names of the 7 farms, including my own, their enterprises, their gross emissions, their gross segregation. Now, the caveat with gross segregation, it's only to tier 1. Segregation is the poor brethren on this journey to net zero, and it's the one that we consistently underinvest in. But we've now got a net vigour for all of those farms. And what you can see is all of those 7 farms are already on a journey to net zero. What is interesting is no 2 farms are the same, although it's ironic that the 2 dairy farms came out nearly identical, and they're 2 totally different systems. That's just a quirk of it. But you can see there also that 2 farms are already beyond net zero today. One of them is a beef and lamb farm. How many times do you actually hear that there are farms today in the United Kingdom beyond net zero? Never talked about, but there are. We've never benchmarked them, we've never measured them, so we don't know. So what did we do then? Once we got this, we went back to this range of technology because we knew we were weak on our carbon segregation. And really what we wanted to do was help AgriCalc get to tier 3 in carbon segregation. So we reached for these technologies. And I'm going to show you, this image here is my farm. This is a LiDAR map of my farm. The different colours are different heights of the above ground biomass. Now my farm is, I'm unusual in regards, I have 5 different land uses. I have permanent grass, I have 250-year-old woodland, I have 30-year-old woodland, I have 120-year-old silver pasture, and I also have short rotation willow crop as an energy crop for renewable heat. And you can see with this, the kind of granularity. If this was a 3D screen, you could rotate this, and you could see it through the vertical axis as well as the horizontal axis. And from this, we can make a carbon asset register. And this is my carbon asset register on my farm, listing then all my hedges, my trees, the acreages, the sizes of them. And the plan is that this will be repeated every 5 years. With this granularity, we can measure change with an integrity unprecedented. What you can also see in my farm is in trees and hedges, I have just over 1,300 tonnes of carbon in my trees. If I then go and look at my soils, and we did the same thing again, but in our soils what we wanted to do is we really wanted to stratify our land. So not just look at my active production land, but look at all the land I manage, which are on my trees as well, okay? And go into them. And so we stratified on how we sampled our soils was against different land uses and different land managements within the same land use to give us then some understanding, is there a difference in our carbon stocks? What you can see in my farm is I have 5,300 tonnes of carbon in my soils. If I convert that to a carbon dioxide equivalence of just under 19,500 tonnes, add back in my trees, I am managing 22,400 tonnes of carbon on my farm before I produce any food or any energy. When you look at it on a 7 farm basis, just 7 farms randomly picked in Northern Ireland are managing just over 500,000 tonnes of carbon every year before they produce any food. That story is never told. And that story is important to tell because it helps you change the narrative of how our sector is perceived. And many times I give this presentation to concerned citizens. Some of them push back quite aggressively at me, how can you support livestock agriculture? And I said, well, before you beat me up, can I just ask you one question? How much carbon do you look after every year? And they look at me, what do you mean? I said, well, how much carbon do you have a responsibility for? I don't know. I said, well, thank you. Actually, I do know. I know my numbers. I look after 24,400 tonnes of carbon every year before I produce an ounce of food for you. So please have some respect for me and my peers who are at the coal face here, is that you need us as well as we need you. And it has to be a partnership. So from that, we then changed our behaviour. And we used AgriCalc in 2021, we used it in 2023, and you can see from those 5 farms, the 2 aren't there, are the 2 that are already beyond net zero. You can see on every single farm, we got behavioural change from a position of knowledge where science was driving our response. But what is really interesting in this is when we did it, we were helped by other factors. Nobody expected in the middle of this that fertiliser would hit £1,000 a tonne. It wasn't terribly hard to convince them to reach for legumes last year, I have to say. So other things, animal health. One of the farms, one of the dairy farms, had a bad outbreak of dysentery, and that really knocked him back. But it really did focus our mind of how we mitigated our greenhouse gases, but also how we start to build our carbon stocks. I said at the start when we went on this, one of the key things we wanted to do, both through the Sustainable Land Management Strategy and ARC Zero, is how could we leverage these new technologies to deliver other multiple public goods. I don't know if many of you have ever seen an image like this. This image is a runoff risk map. It is one field on Hugh Harbison's dairy farm. Most of his fields are actually a lot better than this. This is his worst field, but I picked it for a reason. So both the yellow and the red is where surplus rainfall runs in periods of extreme rainfall. The difference between the red and the yellow is the soil sampling has shown that where there is red, we have high levels of phosphate, so that when the soil is waterlogged, that phosphate is rising and aggravating. So it's our critical source area. But what you'll also see is actually the blue lines. I don't know if I've got a pointer on this or not. The blue line there's our river. And what you can actually see, if we had put a buffer strip the whole way along the river, 80% of the buffer strip would have been absolutely wasted time. Because water does not approach a river at a parallel. It does it at right angles. So Hugh, having seen his AgriCalc report, where he had a big exposure of nitrous oxide emissions from his addiction to synthetic nitrogen on monocultures of perennial ryegrass, Hugh switched. He said, all right, I'm going to do something about it. So this is what Hugh did. He just said, I grudgingly will try a little bit of multi-species swards. Okay? And he decided to put it in this field because what do we know? Legumes and herbs have deep roots. They open up the soil. The reason that's beneficial is rainfall percolates through that soil 14 times faster. So if you want to minimize your runoff risk, actually, we didn't change land use, we changed land management. We got water and nutrient into the soil, we improved the water quality, we got diversity in the soil, we had a 300-fold increase in earthworms, and on this farm here, on this particular field, he has not put any nitrogen fertilizer on for 2 years. Now I know when I'm talking to AIC, that's not what you want to hear, But when I'm talking to DEFRA, onto climate change, onto Mr. Tesco, that is what they want to hear. So that's the dichotomy we're in, okay? So with one behavioural change, he delivered multiple public goods because we informed him in a strategic breadth rather than looking at net zero through a single lens. On my own farm, I mentioned earlier on that I had 5 totally different land uses. You've heard many people today talking about a land use policy, land use strategy. But one of the problems I've had as both a farmer and someone interested in science is it's really important when you change your policy, you make sure there are no perverse outcomes. And I have not seen many publications of forensically analysed different land uses. And so this year I had the pleasure of reaching to Martin's University, and I had a fantastic master's student who was placed on my farm for 4 months. And we went through our 5 different land use with a forensic fine-tooth comb. Because we wanted really to start answering. Now, the data I'm going to show you is from my farm. It is only one farm. Health warning. I would love it from 200 farms, and that's part of what I'm saying to AHDB. But what did we see? Well, the first thing we said, we looked at biodiversity. Everyone thinks biodiversity is the bees and butterflies and birds, okay? 60% of biodiversity happens under the soil. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it. But interesting, if I look at 2 of my indicators, if I look at earthworm populations, really simple, everyone can go and do it. There is a real winner on earthworms. If I go and look at bacterial and fungi communities and their ratios, there's a real winner. And what's the commonality? The commonality is that it has grazing animals defecating on it. What is the role of ruminants' feces in driving soil biology? Never talked about. But quite clearly what you're seeing here is across my land uses, anywhere where I have ruminants, I have an awful lot of soil biology. So before we go and get rid of all our ruminants, we better just think about it. And interestingly, look at my 250-year-old oak trees. My soil biology is absolutely collapsed. Why? Because for the last 300 years, we've fenced animals out of woodlands. We've put no lime on trees. Our soil pH, these two, sit next to me. This is 6.6, this is 4.8 in our brown earth mineral soil because we never put lime on trees. Nobody thinks about it. So the soil pH has collapsed and so is the soil microbiome. If I look at soil organic carbon stocks, the first thing we did is we looked at the soil texture classification. Clay, silt, sand and its variation, and you can see in my farm, actually, I'm really quite unique. I don't have much variability. But look at my soil organic carbon stocks when I go right down to the sea horizon. My sea horizon on my farm was an average of 85 centimetres. You can see there's a real winner, silver pasture. And there's a real loss. And really, our conclusion here is a monoculture of anything does not give you the diverse root architecture of a complex system where you've grazing animals, grass roots, legume roots, herb roots, tree roots. This system here is a compromise. It's this trade-off. It's neither all animals or all trees. And it's really interesting when we went and looked at our carbon stocks. Our 250-year woodland had very little more carbon than our grassland. So as everyone tells us to gallop towards trees, be very careful. Now, I accept this is only one farm, but it's one of the few places actually out there that has this unique landscape. And so we want to see this replicated in 200 or 300 farms to see is this replicated. But what we're seeing is that complexity of root architecture is the key to really driving soil organic carbon alongside pH and alongside the use of organic manures. So the real question then is, can we ramp this up? This is only 7 farms. So as I said earlier on, I had the pleasure of chairing the expert working group in Northern Ireland. So we fed all this back into Northern Ireland government policy. And in May 2022, when we did have a minister, Minister Edwin stood up and he announced that he had secured a possible budget of 45 million, but ring-fenced at 38 with a possible to go to 45, to baseline every tree, hedge and field in the country. Voluntary scheme. Interestingly, We're doing it over 4 years, so a quarter of Northern Ireland each year, with online training with your own results. Okay, so empowering each farmer with their own results, not their neighbours. What we give them is their soil fertility with carbon stocks, runoff risk maps as a whole package. And the idea, if we can, is to repeat it every 5 years. Zone 1 closed in September 2022. We had a 92% farmer take-up. Zone 2 closed at the end of August 2023. We had a 92% take-up. I would encourage you to look at the scheme. I think it is absolutely replicable across the whole of the UK. It is one scheme. It's not a Wild West. One set of standards, apples for apples, not apples for oranges and oranges with bananas. It's one scheme. And the key recognition, I'm really grateful for Charles raising this earlier on, is that this measuring, reporting and verification, the Belfast government has accepted this as a public good. This bit is being paid by the public purse. It is 3% of our annual subvention to agriculture in Northern Ireland. For 3%, we think we get a real good bang for our buck. I just want to stop on the last 3 slides. Is we run a risk in the UK of, after Brexit, being very insular and not looking what else is going on. There are 2 things happening. I'm going to talk about Australia first. Australia saw the difficulties in this, and they created a one structured vehicle called the Clean Air Regulator by the federal government. They included carbon removals from the land-based sector, brought it in 9 years ago, but they set the bar really high. They refused to accept modelling. Everything had to be measured. And for the first time this year, 7 cattle grazing farms have now just got through. 7, all on measuring. This is the Archer Pastoral, and they measured 9 years ago and 2 years ago. They increased carbon stocks by 53 kilos per kilo of live weight grazed over those 7 years, and they sold it for a premium at $93 per tonne. What's interesting, in September time, Beef Central, which is an Australian industry magazine, did a feature on the 7th farm. And what's really interesting is they, over those 7 years, created 94,666 Australian carbon credit units. And when he sold it at $93 a tonne, that single beef producer got a cheque for $8,800,000 Australian dollars. And we've just done a free trade deal with them. And we have nothing. And just to compound it, 2 weeks ago, the European Parliament's Environmental Committee approved the carbon removal from the land-based sector framework. It is to go to full plenary on the condition that our emissions are attached to it at a farm scale. What have I just walked you through? Exactly the same thing. And it looks like that will get approval in the European Union, which also means then for us in the United Kingdom, our nearest competitor, the Republic of Ireland, will have access to a scheme that we don't have. So we need to keep our eyes open. We need to be on top of our game, and we need to use science and integrity to actually stay at the front foot. And I hope I've shown you a level of granularity that will give integrity to any concerned citizen out there. For me, and this is part of my role as the thought leader for AHDB, is I believe the way forward is helping levy payers know their own numbers, empowering them to be better quality farmers, to make better quality decisions. And when you do that and you show them the scope of that toolbox, our farmers in the United Kingdom will deliver. But we need a framework to support them, a single framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I'm sure that will have inspired questions. Get them coming in on Slido, please. Now, please welcome Dr. Martin Scholten from Wageningen and Aarhus Universities for the view from the Netherlands.
Yeah, let me first say that I really appreciate that I'm invited by AIC to share with you the management of natural capital, but then from the Dutch perspective. I see similarities when I hear all the things today. I see differences, and yeah, as always, the most learning points are from the differences. So I will not tell you how it should be done. I'll tell you the Dutch story, and I think afterwards we can continue and thinking about what kind of approaches or mix of approaches is the best way forward. Let me first tell you what we consider in the Netherlands as the natural capital. Actually, our main natural capital is land and water. We are a small country, and we are densely populated with people with high ambitions. And that means that we need land for all those ambitions, especially when you don't want to share your ambitions and you want to take it on your own, and we are economically a liberal country, so we all want to have the capital for ourselves. Then you come to a problem. Well, we overcome that problem for centuries when we create land from water. But that's finite. There's no more land to create from water because also the water is our second natural capital. We have plenty of water, we are in a delta, we have good rain. Sometimes we have an excess of water nowadays, sometimes you have shortage of water nowadays. We never experienced that before, but now we're looking for the balance. So think about land and water as our natural capital. We do not have real nature in our country, it's a created country. So when you're thinking about natural capital as the deep green real nature, we have not so much to offer. Actually, we are the worst performing country in Europe when it comes to biodiversity restoration, biodiversity maintenance. Because all the land is being used by people full of ambitions. Yeah, and when I look at the ambitions, agriculture and agri-food economy is high on the agenda in the Netherlands by tradition. Actually, 60% of our land is farmland. You can think it's not too much, but when you have so densely populated country, 60% is a lot. And 50,000 farmers, 500,000 jobs. 10% of the economy in the Netherlands is based on agri-food economy. And we are proud of that, but we also have a little bit of, we feel it a bit stressy because of all the other ambitions that want land. Think about energy transformation. The best land for agriculture is also the best land to create parks of windmills or to create solar panels on the ground. It's also the best place to build and construct houses, offices, and think of. It's also the space where we find the better mobility, the better access of the different parts in the Netherlands. So that land use by agri-food production is really under pressure. And probably you've heard about it. That pressure also means that there is concerns, that there is an unrest in the country. Probably you've seen pictures of tractors, farmers that really demonstrate against their position in the Netherlands and the perspectives in the Netherlands. Let me go through a little timeline. In 2017, the National Geographic had that wonderful article about how this tiny country feed the world. That was where we came from. So in 2018, it was decided to re-establish the Ministry of Agricultural Nature and Food Quality. Agricultural Nature and Food Quality. It was for 10, 15 years under the Ministry of Economic Affairs. As a principal science to policy advisor in the Netherlands, I was asked to come up with a vision for this new ministry. And we created that vision, which is based on circularity. I'll tell you a little bit more later. But 1 year later, in 2019, we were stuck in the development from the old agri-food system to the new agri-food system by a decision of a juridical decision that the permission for activities in the Netherlands was restricted by nitrogen. And not nitrogen to the water, nitrogen to the air, ammoniac. And NOx. And ammoniac is for a big part coming from the nature, from biology, from agriculture. So there was a strong pressure on agriculture to reduce the ammonium, and otherwise there was no permission to be a farmer. So you can imagine that in 2020, that was 2019, 2020, the farmers were really in stress. I was also a member of the State Advisory Committee on how to solve that nitrogen problem in the Netherlands. I'll tell you a bit later on. But actually it ends up in concerns due to restrictions for the sector. No farmer, no food was the slogan. While we were tending with our vision for the new ministry, with our agricultural vision, to come in the green part, confidence in perspectives for the sector. We wanted to create new perspectives, and also all the changes in the political scene. Every time the mission was, we want perspectives for the agriculture, because it's so important in the Netherlands. And we didn't found it so far. Actually, last year, 2023, or this year, sorry, in 2022, we came with the next advice to say this is the direction that you can go with agriculture in the Netherlands, but in 2023, we didn't came to an agreement between all the societal actors on that roadmap. But probably 2024, next year, will be some change. There is elections in the Netherlands, there is elections in Europe. There is also an insight about the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands due to the fact that we experienced it. Actually, between 2018 and 2023, the development, also the sustainable development of agriculture, stuck in the Netherlands. Let me explain shortly two things. First of all, the vision for agriculture in the Netherlands is based on circularity. Actually, circularity in agriculture resource management. So far, we were mainly focused on food security, high productivity, putting in the resources needed for food security and high productivity. But then we realized that in a small country, when you put in more resources than you're finally yielding, harvesting from the agricultural system, that's the main source for emissions. And if you want to come to mitigation, there is a really key for mitigation. And moreover, the resources become an important cost for farmers in producing. Because of scarcity. The whole world is using the same resources. So we came with a vision on focusing on resource efficiency by circularity. Actually, that means use the circular resources, produce circular resources, so that you do not have waste and losses, that you, but also considering the One Health aspect. It was the pandemic period, adaptively connected to the environment and the diversification of agricultural landscapes. John, your talk was really in the heart of that. And a credible perspective. The other one, the Dutch nitrogen quest. I'm often asked, Martin, can you explain what happens in the Netherlands? Why is the agricultural progress so stuck? It's difficult to explain because it is a situation that we have caused ourselves in the Netherlands by putting in the nature management policy in a kind of very simple form, to say the quality of nature is a function of the deposition of nitrogen on nature. Well, the quality of nature is depending on more factors than only the nitrogen, but we try to simplify the European legislation on nature conservation in this way. Actually, we could have chosen for other legislation which is more focused on tailored nature management promotion and nature management measures. But we did it in this way, and it looked good because it there was room. Until some of the permissions were accused for court because the quality of nature in the Netherlands is not that good compared to other parts in Europe, because we have that densely populated country. And a lot of factors that are restricting the nature development. But we have a legislation that says, well, the only key, the only thing to steer the nature quality is nitrogen. And then we had to come to a nitrogen policy, and not a nitrogen emission policy, but a nitrogen deposition policy, and that's very difficult. Nitrogen comes in the air from various sources, lands on the nature at short distance, at long distance, etc. Very complex, and we had a very simple model, calculation model to do that, to connect emissions to depositions. And that's the model that the court is using when judging on the validity of permissions. Not only for farming, permission for farming, but also permission for other activities. Well, this is the situation, but I see that we come to a tipping point in rebalancing. That point is in sight. It's not only due to probably political change, but especially the political insights that are there, not from one party to the other party. We have the elections next week, within 1 week. Actually, next week, Wednesday. 27 parties are there. The biggest one has about 14% of the votes. So a very difficult situation, but that's always in the Netherlands, and it's increasing and it's increasing. But we see that the insights on that we have a situation that is, that you cannot sustain with the nitrogen, that there is something in the air that might change. And actually, we have 2 of the 27 are. One is led by the Euro Commissioner, Frans Timmermans, that was the architect of the Green Deal and the architect of the nature conservation in Europe. And the other one is from the Farmers and Rural Party. But I think all the other 25 has some way an opinion on this, and some way are willing to find a solution to come out of the the situation that we have. So I think that policy will take over the steering of the court. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation, and that is about what can we expect as next step, both in the Dutch scenery, but also in the European scenery. We see that a focus singly on the environmental, the planetary boundaries for the transition is becoming more and more in balance, also to the societal perspectives, economic perspectives, the just transition. Especially when it comes to the rural communities. In the Netherlands, you have seen over the last 2 years polarization between the urban communities and the rural communities. And yeah, when you live with so many people in a country, it's not good to have that split in your society. So we have to rebalance and we have to rebridge the societies. That also means a just transition for the rural areas as well. So the just transition is, I think, the key word that is in the air. It doesn't mean that the planetary boundaries and the safe transition is out of sight, but it's coming in more a balance. And yeah, what you heard from John, that it is the way forward is not only a technical way, a technical innovation, but it's also about people and practices. It is about how you do your work. Also, how you use your technologies. Actually, in court, in the Netherlands, there is a lot about the discussion if technology improvement is good or bad. Technology improvement in our domain, agri-food domain, is good or bad. And there is always a good practice and a bad practice, and then the bad practice is being used from a precautionary principle to be the bottom, the reference point. Which is not good, because the technology helps you to come to the best practice that belongs to you as person, as people. And it should be about prospects and perspectives, so it should be looking forward. And I think the III is really the one that brings us further. An integrative approach, an inclusive approach, take all aboard, and an interdisciplinary approach when it comes to scientific support, a place-based approach, a tailored place-based approach. What is your environment? What are your resources available? What are the markets that are in reach? And what kind of farmer you are? And how can the agribusiness support you as a farmer in that journey? And how can society support you as a farmer in that journey? So we strongly focus on that, and there we also look for international cooperation. And yeah, we find that, for instance, in Scotland, with our partner SRUC, Wageningen University and SRUC, we find that cooperation in a just transition to a thriving rural natural economy. And here you see that in that concept, natural capital is one of the capitals that is important. Also the human capital and the social capital and the institutional capital are very important to make it happen, to make the best out of the natural capital that we can do as a society. With stewardship, I heard that word this morning as well. A very nice Scottish word, duchess, looks like Dutch, but really takes that stewardship into account. Land, people, and culture take that into account. And it's not only with Scotland, it's with more countries, because, and that's my really final slide and my final message, we have in Europe an area, a belt, a green belt of natural capital for food. That's running from Ireland to the Baltics. And that is the area where it is best to produce food. Best to produce food in a sustainable way, but it is the area best to produce food. So we have to be very keen as Europe, not only as European Union, but as Europe as a whole, that we use this area in the best way, with the best stewardship for agri-food production. And it also means that, that's also the perspective from the Netherlands, that we want a strong alliance of those countries that not only have the ability, but also the responsibility to be a good food producer for Europe, for the food sovereignty in Europe, from a valid resource a sufficiency perspective. And think about natural capital. It's all about biomass that is produced in natural environment, that the natural capital is a key in a bio-based society, because the bio-based society is about that resource, so we have to be very keen on the bio-based resource, including our main essential food. Thank you.
Come sit down. We've got lots and lots of questions for you both. Let's start with one for both of you. How can food companies and retailers help share the risk with farmers who are making big changes to their systems to reach net zero? John, do you want to kick off?
Well, the first thing I would ask is actually we do it in a transparent way and we reduce the emotion and we actually measure it. So one of the biggest pressures coming from retailers through food processing companies down to us as farmers is actually the request for us to give them data on Scope 3 emission, so they can fill in their Scope 3 emission declarations. But my frustration actually is I don't deliver just emission reductions, I deliver carbon removals as well. So actually I need a help from them, is can we have a Scope 3 net carbon declaration? Because certainly that's a game changer. I'm now interested. It's not just measuring what I'm doing wrong, it's also measuring what I'm doing right. And so we actually need to have some strategic thinking. The key to get farmers to help in this and for the whole supply chain to de-risk it is there has to be something in it for everybody. And at the moment it's very one-sided. It all is coming down the line to me as a farmer.
Should they be paying you for it, whether they do extra or not?
Well, I think the first thing, before we start talking about who pays what, okay, is actually we need to have a state of the nation baseline. Where are we? Because I will argue we don't know that. People tell me we do. Well, we found when we did this granularity of baseline, we were in a completely different place to where we thought we were in. Once you've done that, you can have then the educated conversation. Who does what? My own feeling for a lot of natural capital during an affordability crisis, it is really hard for the food chain to pay for that extra. And that is why you're seeing the likes of the European Union and Australia actually looking at, is there another way to bring private investment in? And they've been using carbon through that way as a backdoor way, knowing that consumers are really struggling to pay to buy food today.
Martin.
Yeah, I cannot speak for the UK situation because I'm not fully into that. But for the Dutch situation, I can tell you that the agribusiness and the farmers should be re-establish their connection, re-establish their feeling that they are both in the mission. They're now too much the supplier and the customer in a kind of business way. And it should be much more close. The cooperatives that we had in the past, which are the founding fathers of the business companies that we now have in the Netherlands, were from the farmers. So that was very closely linked. When I'm working for part of my time in Denmark, I see that the institutional organization in Denmark is in such a way organized that farmers and the business are really partners in finding the future. and really having a fair share of the business that is there. So the farmers are not just the final customers of the agribusiness. The agribusiness plus the farmers can find their benefits and can find their earnings in a society that is willing to pay food, and food is a public good, is willing to pay not only the food, but also the food production and the public goods related to the food production.
Okay. Looking at the system which John has been involved with in Northern Ireland, Anonymous says, assuming that the UK government isn't going to be the organisation which organises and funds this type of system in the UK, who else could?
Well, I think that's an assumption too far. Let's put it into context. The scheme in Northern Ireland is 45 million over 4 years. It's 11 million a year. AHDB have worked that out. If we were taking England, just ring fence England a moment, it would be 75 million to do England on an annual basis over 4 years. In the total subvention to agriculture in England, 75 million is about 3%. Are we saying that 3% is too much to actually do a really comprehensive baseline that allows them then, when farmers then apply under SFI or ELMS, they can then justify why they're applying because their baseline says they're strong here, they're weak here. So I want to do this because my baseline says I'm weak here. Knowing that you've got a system that comes back every 5 years to check it, and then you can go back then to Treasury and say, you invested this amount of public funds, this is what we did with it. Because remember, the next comprehensive spending review, our industry is up against school and hospitals. And if we do not show to concerned citizens, to governments, and to Treasury that the investment in our sector, if it doesn't deliver value for money, bang for buck for public money, we're not going to get it. So I go back and say, I'm not ready to accept the assumption. Now, that doesn't mean that DEFRA actually does the organising. The key thing we have done in Northern Ireland, we have used a non-departmental public body. In Northern Ireland, it's AFBI. AHDB could do the same thing in England, okay? And that has been very useful because we've built, it has to be built around trust. Because you produce an awful lot of data. Who owns the data? Now, in Northern Ireland, the data belongs to the government because they paid for it, but we have a written undertaking from the Minister and from the Department it will not be used for regulation. It will be anonymised at a catchment level, so we get catchment data as such to help us on water quality. But the custodian of the data is the non-departmental public body who actually then has the trust of farmers that that data is only released to people who they give permission to.
Martin, do you want to come around this? No. Okay. 2 quick questions for you, John. What's the cost of baselining per hectare?
So the scheme in Northern Ireland is 45 million divided by 800,000 hectares. It's roughly £56 per hectare.
Okay. How did you get such a high level, 92% of farmer engagement?
Because there's a carrot and a stick. The carrot is you get unprecedented information about your farm you've never seen before. The LiDAR images, the soil analysis, the above ground biomass, the runoff risk maps, they are actually stunning. And if you are a farmer who wants a future, you will embrace that. It's really good, and training, okay? So most people do it for that reason, but we have a stick. The scheme in Northern Ireland is voluntary, but it is your way of proving to the Exchequer that you're interested in public goods. If you want any other scheme relating to farm, you have to go through the voluntary scheme of the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme. So we've made it the door to which you get everything else. So do you know something? That's why we've got 92%.
Okay, Martin.
Joint up thinking.
Martin, can you have intensive circular farming, high input, output, high efficiency? Or as you increase input, will you always hit a ceiling of efficiency of outputs?
Well, actually, the baseline is a high productivity. So high output with the highest efficiency, with the lowest as possible inputs. So not more inputs than really needed. because the extra input doesn't bring you the extra output. That is the situation in nature, where when you look at the natural ecosystem, you see that they strive to the highest productivity based on eco-efficiency and no resources being wasted. And I think that's the way how we are looking at the circular farming, intensive circular farming. Indeed, we have to produce food, but we have to be safe in our using the resources for that.
Okay. I'm just going to not let you answer because I'm moving on. Sorry. Several companies already pay farmers for storing and reducing carbon. Should their methods of calculating carbon, be replaced by a national approved scheme?
So Australia have just done that.
Mm-hmm. Should we?
Yes, I do. Because, you know, you have to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And any of the schemes out there today have not got the granularity that we're now talking about. You know, companies like Agri-Carbon from Dundee, measuring soil carbon to a metre deep, the forensic analysis that they now have, and at the price point that you can do whole regions, I think that's what we should be embracing.
But there is one element, and that it should be based on measures. It should be based on place-based measures, on farm-based measures. Do not make the mistake, as we did with the nitrogen in the Netherlands, that you can think that models, simple calculation models, or even sophisticated but still calculation models with a lot of default values, brings you the real performance. There is a variance of a tenfold between the best and the worst performing practice. And you want farmers to be rewarded for good performance in their practice. So it should be based on measures. I see a lot also in the Netherlands, I see a lot of carbon accrediting systems being created by accountants. And they only can work with default type of models. No,
Correct.
It should be close to the practice, so that it's not only rational, it's also a gut feeling that you're doing the good things and you are rewarded for that.
And there, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it. We've got loads more questions, but time has beaten us. Grab these gentlemen on their way out. Thank you very much, both of you. We're reaching the end of the day. Let's have our final Slido. See if we can find some optimism in the room. Does the industry believe that the agri-supply sector is in a strong position to manage natural capital in the agri-supply chain in the coming years? Please vote now on your phones, laptops. Okay. Does the industry believe that the agri-supply sector is in a strong position to manage natural capital in the agri-supply chain in the coming years? We're mildly disagreeing with that as a room, although quite a lot of neutral people and some optimists. It's actually quite close now. Look at that moving around. Yep, so, neutral and mildly disagreeing and mildly agreeing. I mean, at least it's all mild. We're all somewhere in the middle, I think, on that question. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all your questions. I have never been at a conference where there have been so many questions and so many good questions. So thank you very much indeed for being so involved, because it makes all the difference. Could I now invite Chris Guest, AIC's president, to close the conference?
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you. Well, what an informative day we have had. I have no intention of reiterating all we have heard, but I hope each one of you has picked up valuable thoughts and ideas for yourself and for your businesses. To pick out a few highlights or key topics for me, the first would be, in certain instances, we should perhaps not prepare too far in advance. Things like cabinet reshuffles and lower than expected inflation figures can throw a spanner in the works. Within the excellent presentations from our speakers, a number of common points came through with our exciting new report published today. And just to reiterate what Ed said, please, I urge you to take a copy if you haven't already done so. Topics such as collaboration, A key point to work together to solve a number of these complex issues. Food security is not the same as self-sufficiency. Land use frameworks. Land use strategy has never been more important, and a key element is the right thing in the right place at the right time. Joined up thinking. There is no silver bullet in solving our productivity challenges in harmony with our sustainability and environmental targets. And to quote the report, we need an intergovernmental, interdepartmental, interdisciplinary thinking to get the best consensus. All of this under the scope that global population needs will mean we need to increase food production by between 30 and 60% by 2050. Therefore, we need that joined-up thinking to give long-term confidence for business to invest and uptake new technologies to help deliver these productivity increases, but also deliver on our net zero, climate change, environmental and biodiversity targets. And from John's presentation, we all need to know our numbers. At the start of today, I urged our members, stakeholders in the agri-food supply chain and government to collaborate in this most turbulent of times. Not half an hour later, we heard the findings of an independent report that AIC commissioned on food security and agricultural productivity that I've just highlighted a few points from. To me, the signals are obvious that the agri-food industry and the entire nation would benefit greatly from having a valuable oversight of an independent UK Food Security Committee. So let's all work together to make that happen for a more secure and sustainable food supply. As I close, let me say a few thank yous on behalf of everybody. To Charlotte for keeping us on schedule and at times challenging our speakers. So I think we have a token of appreciation, Charlotte, for you.
Really kind, thank you. Thank you very much.
I got Robert to do that because if anybody was here last year, they'll notice that I juggled them. To all our speakers, can I say a heartfelt thanks for your excellent presentations and quality engagement. To our sponsors and partners for their continued support. Events like this do not just happen. So I thank on your behalf the AIC team, led by our Chief Operating Officer, John Kelly, he's not very cheap, for all that they have done, especially for coping with so many uncertainties and changes right up to the last minute, and managing the dinner and conference last night so brilliantly. Your efforts have really paid off, so thank you. Finally, I thank you all for coming, for your engagement and for your mastery of the technology. I trust you have learned from the day and enjoyed listening to some of the important issues that will affect your organisation now and over the coming years. As mentioned earlier, I don't know whether we have actually mentioned this yet, your feedback is very important to us. So please, if you can complete the online feedback form and let us know your views so we can tailor future events. This can be found on the Slido, and you will also be sent up a follow-up email with the instructions. So I declare the AIC Conference 2023 closed. May you all have continued success in your business and look forward to working with Natural Captial within the agri-food supply chain, both now and for the future. Thank you.